Easygoing is probably the word my friends would use to describe me. I'm not one for confrontation. I like my mornings quiet, my evenings peaceful, and generally avoid drama like the plague. I work hard, I pay my taxes, and I try to be a good neighbor. I even put my shopping cart back in the corral, every single time. So, the idea that I'd be embroiled in a full-blown war with my homeowners association, complete with legal threats, passive-aggressive memos, and, yes, a freaking moat, was honestly the furthest thing from my mind. I'm the kind of guy who prefers to compromise, to find a solution that works for everyone. But there's a limit, you know. A point where you have to draw a line in the sand, or, in my case, dig a trench in the yard. Because beneath this mild-mannered exterior lies a stubborn streak, a refusal to be bullied, especially when I know I'm right. And this whole thing started with something so unbelievably petty, my lawn. Rand ID, 9 times 10 to the power of 57. And when I say, my lawn, I use the term loosely. It was grass, mostly. A mix of Kentucky bluegrass, some fescue, and a healthy dose of whatever else the wind decided to blow in. I mowed it regularly, kept it a respectable height, you know, homeowner stuff. But apparently, respectable wasn't good enough for the HOA. The official violation notice cited unacceptable levels of non-approved vegetation and failure to maintain uniformity with neighboring properties. In layman's terms, a few dandelions had the audacity to bloom, and my grass wasn't the exact shade of green as Mrs. Henderson's meticulously manicured, chemically dependent carpet next door. I'm not exaggerating when I say there were maybe 3 dandelions, and honestly, I thought they added a touch of cheerful yellow to the landscape. But apparently, cheerfulness is a code violation in our community. The fine? A cool $100. For dandelions. I swear, you can't make this stuff up. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions or stereotype people, but the HOA representative who delivered the violation notice, well, let's just say she lived up to the name, Karen. Her name was actually Deborah, but Karen just felt more appropriate. She had the haircut, the pursed lips, and the uncanny ability to make you feel like you were personally responsible for the downfall of Western civilization, all because of a few weeds. She caught me watering my petunias when she marched onto my property, violation notice clutched in her hand like a sacred text. Mr. Henderson, she began, her voice dripping with disapproval, and misidentifying me, which was a nice touch. I trust you've received our notification regarding the deficiencies in your lawn maintenance. She emphasized deficiencies like it was a communicable disease. The HOA takes these matters very seriously. Non-compliance will result in further fines and, potentially, legal action. All this over dandelions. Being the reasonable person I am, I decided to nip this in the bud. I went out the next day, armed with a dandelion digger and a bag of weed killer, the environmentally friendly kind. Of course, I'm not a monster. I meticulously removed every single dandelion, even the ones hiding in the furthest corners of my yard. I even fertilized the lawn, hoping to achieve that coveted uniform green hue. I sent the HOA photographic evidence of my compliance, expecting a pat on the back and a swift resolution. Instead, I received another notice a week later. This time, the violation was inconsistent grass blade length and presence of unidentified plant species. Apparently, my efforts to appease the HOA had only made things worse. The goalposts had officially been moved. It wasn't about dandelions anymore, it was about control. That's when the fines started to pile up. The second notice came with a $200 penalty. Then, a week later, another one for $400, citing willful negligence in maintaining property standards. The notices themselves became increasingly aggressive, less like polite reminders and more like legal threats. They quoted obscure clauses from the HOA rulebook, referencing things like Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, Paragraph 12, which, as far as I could tell, was about the proper placement of garden gnomes, which I didn't even own. I tried reasoning with them, sending emails, attending HOA meetings, which were basically just Karen lecturing a room full of increasingly disgruntled homeowners. But it was like talking to a brick wall. They were determined to make an example of me, to show everyone who was boss. And that's when I knew I had to do something drastic. The breaking point came when I received a certified letter informing me that the HOA was initiating foreclosure proceedings on my house due to the unpaid fines. Foreclosure. Over dandelions and slightly uneven grass. That's when something inside me snapped. The reasonable, compromising guy disappeared, replaced by a slightly unhinged individual with a shovel and a dream. I realized I couldn't win by playing by their rules. They made the rules, they interpreted the rules, and they changed the rules whenever it suited them. So, I decided to play a different game, one where the rules were, let's just say, a little more fluid. I was done trying to appease them. It was time to fight back, not with lawyers and paperwork, but with ingenuity and a healthy dose of defiance. It was time to dig a moat. Now, you might be wondering, why a moat? Well, several factors contributed to this unique solution. First, I've always appreciated a bit of privacy. My house sits a little too close to the street, and I'd often fantasize about having some kind of natural barrier. Second, I'm a big fan of nature. I've always wanted a pond, and the idea of having koi swimming around in my backyard appealed to my inner child. But let's be honest, the biggest reason was pure, unadulterated spite. I wanted to create something so outlandish, so undeniably absurd, that the HOA would have no choice but to back down. It was a calculated act of rebellion, a middle finger to bureaucratic overreach disguised as a landscape improvement project. And the image of Karen's face when she saw it? Priceless. It was the perfect blend of practicality, aesthetics, and rebellious humor. Plus, who forecloses on a guy with a moat? It just seems uncivilized. Of course, I couldn't just start digging a giant trench in my yard without doing a little planning first. I spent hours researching local ordinances, HOA rules, ironically, and anything I could find about pond construction. Turns out, there were regulations about the depth and proximity to property lines, but nothing explicitly prohibiting moats. I even consulted a lawyer friend who specializes in property disputes. His advice? Make it look intentional and call it landscaping. I sketched out a design, carefully measuring the distance from the house and the property line. I made sure it was deep enough to be impressive but shallow enough to avoid any accidental drownings, safety first, even when rebelling. Then came the fun part, gathering materials. I ordered a truckload of pond liner, a pump, filters, rocks, and aquatic plants. I even splurged on a little bridge to cross the moat, because why not? This wasn't just about defiance, it was about creating something beautiful, and slightly ridiculous. Then came the digging. I rented a small excavator, figuring it would be faster and easier than doing it by hand. I quickly discovered that easier is a relative term when you're trying to maneuver a giant metal claw in your backyard without destroying your sprinkler system or hitting a gas line. The first day was mostly rocks. Big rocks. Rocks that seemed to have been strategically placed by a team of ancient giants specifically to thwart my moat-digging ambitions. Then, just as I was starting to make progress, I hit a pipe. Luckily, it was just a drainage pipe, but it still required some creative rerouting. And then there were the neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, of course, was out there every 5 minutes, tooting and shaking her head. Others were more curious, offering unsolicited advice and taking pictures. One even brought me lemonade, which was a nice touch. Let's just say, digging a moat is not a solitary activity. It's a community event, whether you want it to be or not. I knew it wouldn't be long before Karen caught wind of my landscaping project. And I was right. On the third day of digging, just as I was starting to line the trench with the pond liner, I heard her unmistakable voice screeching from across the yard. She stood there, hands on her hips, her face a mask of disbelief and outrage. What is this, she sputtered, gesturing wildly at the half-finished moat. I calmly explained that it was a decorative water feature, a landscaping enhancement designed to improve property values. Her response was not what you'd call reasonable. She accused me of violating numerous HOA regulations, threatened to call the city, and even suggested that I was mentally unstable. "This is an outrage," she shrieked. "You can't just dig a moat in your yard." I simply smiled and continued laying the pond liner. The show was just getting started. The next step was to fill the moat with water and introduce the piece de resistance, the koi fish. I ordered a dozen of them online, a mix of colors and patterns, each one more flamboyant than the last. When they arrived, I carefully acclimated them to the water temperature and gently released them into their new home. Watching them glide through the water, weaving between the aquatic plants, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. It was no longer just a ditch, it was a legitimate water feature, a thriving ecosystem. Of course, Karen was less than thrilled. She returned the next day with a cease and desist letter, claiming the koi pond violated the HOA's regulations regarding livestock and unapproved water features. I pointed out that koi are technically fish, not livestock, and that the pond was clearly a landscaping enhancement, as my lawyer friend had advised. Her face turned an even deeper shade of red. The battle lines were drawn. I wasn't about to back down. I prepared a detailed presentation for the next HOA meeting, arguing that the koi pond was not only aesthetically pleasing but also environmentally beneficial. I cited studies showing that ponds attract beneficial insects, reduce water runoff, and provide habitat for local wildlife. I even argued that it increased property values, pointing to several real estate articles that highlighted the appeal of water features. Then came the loophole. I discovered a little-known clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed for water features designed for educational purposes, provided they were approved by a majority vote of the homeowners. I argued that the koi pond was educational because it taught children about aquatic ecosystems and responsible pet ownership, never mind that I didn't have any children. It was a long shot, but I figured it was worth a try. Besides, I had the distinct impression that some of the other neighbors were starting to enjoy the spectacle. The neighborhood was definitely divided. Mrs. Henderson, predictably, was firmly in the anti-moat camp, spreading rumors about mosquito infestations and plummeting property values. A few other neighbors, the ones who always followed the rules to the letter, echoed her concerns. But to my surprise, many people were supportive. Some admired my audacity, others simply found the whole situation hilarious. One neighbor, a retired biology teacher, even offered to help me identify the aquatic plants. Several families with young children would stop by to admire the koi, and I even caught a few teenagers taking selfies in front of the moat. The HOA meeting was standing room only. As I presented my case, I could feel the tension in the room. Karen glared at me from across the table, while several neighbors nodded in agreement with my arguments. It was clear that the community was split, and the vote could go either way. The fate of my moat, and perhaps my house, hung in the balance. The vote was a tie. Karen, as HOA president, cast the tie-breaking vote against me. But that wasn't the end of it. The HOA filed a lawsuit, demanding that I fill in the moat and pay all outstanding fines and legal fees. The next few months were a blur of legal documents, depositions, and awkward HOA meetings. Karen and I became archenemies, exchanging icy glares and passive-aggressive comments whenever our paths crossed. I argued that the HOA was selectively enforcing its rules, pointing out several other properties with unapproved landscaping features that had gone unpunished. I even hired a landscaping expert to testify that the moat was, in fact, a beneficial addition to the community. The HOA, in turn, hired a pond expert, who claimed the koi were a nuisance and a threat to public health. It was absurd, but it was also deadly serious. My house was on the line. Then, something unexpected happened. A local news reporter got wind of the story. They interviewed me, filmed the moat, and the koi, and ran a segment on the evening news titled, "Man Fights HOA Over Lawn, Digs Moat." The story went viral. Suddenly, I was inundated with calls from other news outlets, radio stations, and even a few national television programs. Everyone wanted to hear about the moat man who stood up to bureaucratic overreach. The media portrayed me as a folk hero, a symbol of the little guy fighting against the tyranny of homeowners associations. The HOA, predictably, was not pleased with the attention. They tried to spin the story, claiming I was a menace to the community and a danger to public safety. But the public wasn't buying it. They saw through the HOA's PR efforts and recognized the absurdity of the situation. And that's when things started to change. The increased scrutiny put a spotlight on Karen's behavior. Other homeowners began to come forward with stories of petty fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and general mistreatment. It turned out I wasn't the only one who felt unfairly targeted. An internal investigation was launched into the HOA's practices, and Karen's leadership was called into question. The investigation revealed several instances of abuse of power, including using HOA funds for personal expenses and selectively enforcing rules against homeowners she didn't like. The pressure mounted, and Karen eventually resigned as HOA president. A new election was held, and a more reasonable, community-oriented board was elected. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a significant step in the right direction. The reign of Karen was over, and a new era of cooperation and common sense was dawning in our neighborhood. With Karen gone and a new board in place, the lawsuit was eventually dropped. We reached a settlement. I agreed to pay a small portion of the original fines, a symbolic gesture, really, and the HOA agreed to recognize the koi pond as an approved water feature, with certain restrictions, no adding alligators, for example. The moat remained. The new board even apologized for the previous administration's heavy-handed tactics and promised to be more responsive to the needs of the community. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a far cry from foreclosure. I had stood my ground, fought for what I believed in, and emerged victorious, sort of. And I still had my koi pond. Looking back, I realized the moat was the best thing I ever did to my property. It provides a level of privacy I never had before. The gentle sound of the waterfall is incredibly soothing, and watching the koi swim around is a surprisingly relaxing way to spend an afternoon. It's also become a conversation starter. People are fascinated by it, and it's brought a lot of joy to the neighborhood, even to some of the initial skeptics. Mrs. Henderson still glares at it occasionally, but even she has to admit it's a unique and beautiful addition to the landscape. But the biggest benefit is the sense of satisfaction I get from knowing that I stood up for myself and fought for what I believed in. I didn't let the HOA bully me into submission. I turned a ridiculous situation into something positive, something that brought beauty and a little bit of whimsy into my life. So, what did I learn from this whole ordeal? First and foremost, stand up for yourself. Don't let anyone bully you, especially when you know you're in the right. But also, be reasonable. Pick your battles, and don't be afraid to compromise when necessary. Second, know your rights. Read the HOA bylaws, yes, all of them. Understand local ordinances. Don't be afraid to consult a lawyer if you need to. Knowledge is power. Third, a little bit of humor can go a long way. Sometimes, the best way to fight absurdity is with more absurdity. Digging a moat might not be the answer for everyone, but finding a creative way to express your defiance can be incredibly empowering. Finally, remember that you're part of a community. Even if you disagree with some of your neighbors, try to find common ground. Building relationships and fostering a sense of community can make all the difference. And always put your shopping cart back in the corral. So, if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, facing down a tyrannical HOA over something as trivial as dandelions, remember my story. Remember the moat. And remember that sometimes, the most effective way to deal with a frustrating situation is to embrace the absurdity, to fight fire with, well, water. Because life is too short to sweat the small stuff. Life is too short to let petty bureaucrats dictate how you live on your own property. And life is definitely too short to not have a koi pond. Who knows, maybe one day, moats will become a standard feature in suburban landscapes. Maybe they'll even be required by the HOA. And when that day comes, I'll be ready. I'll be sitting on my little bridge, watching my koi swim around, and chuckling to myself, knowing that I played a small part in making the world a slightly more whimsical place. And that all started with a few dandelions.